What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Echoes of Elsewhere, the podcast about urban exploration, abandoned places, and the mysteries left behind when the world stops looking. I'm your host, Courtney Autumn. Today, we're stepping back beyond the abandoned again. This is the segment where we explore disappearances, unexplained discoveries, hauntings, and true crime cases connected to abandoned spaces, from the stories that unfold in these overlooked corners of the world to the mysteries that remain unanswered. Because sometimes the most important part of a story isn't the moment something is found. It's everything that unfolded before it was ever seen. Today's story begins the way many unsettling stories do. Not with violence, not with chaos, but with absence. A missing person, a quiet South Carolina town, an abandoned structure no one paid attention to, and a discovery that would quietly reshape the understanding a small town once had about what happens when someone in their community becomes a headline for a case as unusual as the circumstances surrounding it. There's a strange moment in every investigation like this. Before identity, before headlines, before a victim becomes a person in the public eye, there is only the discovery. A location, a condition, a detail that doesn't yet make emotional sense because it hasn't been anchored to a human life. And in that space, the mind tries to fill in the blanks. What happened here? How long has this place been abandoned? And why was this place chosen for what would be discovered? Part 1, Before the Story Has a Name. In the heart of Walterboro, South Carolina, an abandoned building sits quietly, like so many others that blend into the background of small towns. The kind of structure you pass without noticing, the kind of place that stops being part of daily awareness long before it physically disappears. Windows dark, entry points seemingly boarded, a building in that in-between state, not maintained, not demolished, just forgotten. But abandoned places rarely stay empty. They sometimes have a way of becoming something else. Temporary shelter, a secret gathering place, someone's storage space, or sometimes something far more difficult to explain. It started with a report, a concern, something that in the spring of 2024 brought officers to a building that on paper should have been irrelevant. No active business, no routine presence, no reason for daily attention. But when they arrived, something immediately shifted. Because abandonment doesn't mean absence. It just means absence of expectation. Approaching the building, the air changed before anything else did. That's often how these stories begin. Not visually, but physically. A smell, a pressure, a realization that something inside the space no longer belongs to the category of undisturbed. As officers moved into the abandoned structure, they found something that didn't belong there. A suitcase. Not stored, not discarded casually, but positioned in a way that immediately raised questions. And inside that suitcase was something that transformed the entire investigation. A body. Part 2. When abandonment becomes evidence. The moment the discovery is made, the building changes classification. It was no longer just abandoned. It became the center of an investigation, or at the very least, a starting point. A container of unanswered questions. A place where time had done something unnatural. Not stopped, but concealed. Because abandoned buildings don't just preserve truth, they delay it. They hold it just long enough for everything else to move on. And immediately the questions began. Who was this person? How long have they been here? Was this place chosen deliberately, or was it simply available? The suitcase itself became a focal point, because suitcases are not random objects in situations like this. They imply movement, transition, intent. Something a person is meant to carry from one place to another, not something meant to carry a person from one place to another. And that reversal is part of what makes cases like this so unsettling, because nothing about it feels accidental, even when the answers remain unclear. Before there is identity, there's often a gap in time, and that gap is where most mysteries live. Days become weeks, weeks turn into silence, silence forms into assumptions, and assumptions are one of the most dangerous forces in missing person cases, because it allows absence to feel normal. In this case, there was a period of time where a woman had not been seen, not publicly accounted for, not immediately reported missing, and in that space, between the last confirmed sighting and the moment authorities were alerted, the trail begins to thin. Not because nothing happened, but because something happened, but nothing was documented in real time. In turn, investigators are left reconstructing a timeline from fragments, memories, messages, partial accounts, things that were never meant to become evidence until they suddenly had to be. Part 3, a name enters the story. At some point, the investigation shifts, from unknown remains to a missing person report to identity confirmation.
What started as a missing persons case has now since become a murder investigation.
The Walterboro Police Department says a body that was discovered on Wednesday was today confirmed to be that of 32-year-old Victoria Jean Beach of Walterboro.
And that, like in most cases, is when everything changes. The discovery inside the abandoned building is connected to a missing woman from the area, a 32-year-old, someone who had been reported missing in April of 2024. And eventually her name is confirmed, Victoria Beach. And now the story is no longer abstract. It has weight, it has a person attached to it. But even with a name, the central question remains unchanged. How did she end up inside that building? Part 4, the timeline. One of the most unsettling parts of cases like this is not what is known, but what is unclear. There's a detail in this case that sits just outside the main headlines, but once you notice it, it changes the shape of everything, at least in my opinion. Victoria Beach was reported missing on April 10th, 2024, the very same day her remains were discovered. Maybe it's a coincidence or simply a matter of timing. After all, there are occasions when someone is reported missing and found shortly afterwards because authorities suddenly have a reason to start looking. But that's not usually how these stories go. More often than not, missing adults, especially women, can fall through the cracks. Their disappearance is dismissed or deprioritized while days, weeks, and sometimes even years pass without answers. Not to mention, when you place it next to what investigators actually encountered inside that abandoned building, it becomes something harder to explain away. Because the condition of the remains suggested something very different from a same-day disappearance. Something older, something that had already been unfolding long before anyone made that call. While investigators never stated exactly how long she was actually missing, they did say it's likely she had been deceased for 2 to 4 weeks before she was found. And that's where the eeriness settles in. Not in the discovery itself, but in the disconnect between two timelines that refuse to line up cleanly. On one side, there is the administrative moment, the point where a person is officially entered into the system as missing, a report filed, a case opened. But on the other side, there's biological time, and biological time doesn't care about paperwork. It doesn't reset when someone picks up a phone. It doesn't begin when a report is filed. It simply continues forward, uninterrupted. So when investigators confirmed the discovery inside the abandoned structure, they weren't just dealing with a missing person case. They were dealing with a timeline that already felt like it had been in motion for longer than the system had acknowledged. And that gap, that quiet mismatch between what was reported and what was physically present, is often where the most uncomfortable questions live. How long had that building been holding on to what was inside? How long had that space gone unnoticed in exactly the wrong way? And what does it mean when a system is just arriving at a story that may have already been over for some time? These are the kinds of details that don't always change the official facts of a case, but they do change the way a story feels. Because suddenly, it isn't about when something was discovered, it's about how long it had been waiting there before anyone realized they were already behind on a timeline that started long before anyone was aware. From this point, investigators begin working backward, from discovery to report, from report to last known sighting, from last known sighting into speculation about movement, contact, and circumstance. And in that backward reconstruction, small inconsistencies become large questions, not because they prove anything, but because they don't prove anything. And that leaves space for a lot of different possibilities. Part 5, the abandoned building and the suitcase. Abandoned buildings appear in cases like this more often than people realize. Not because they are inherently connected to crime, but because they are structurally invisible. They exist in public space without being actively monitored or even noticed. They sit outside of routine attention. They become blind spots. And blind spots are where delayed discovery happens, because even in populated areas, there are places people stop seeing, not physically, but mentally. The building becomes part of the background until something forces it back into focus. And in this case, what forced it back into focus was not the structure itself, but what was found inside. It's difficult to ignore the symbolism of a suitcase in a discovery like this, because it forces a contradiction. A suitcase is meant for travel, for movement, for transition between places, but here, it represents the opposite of movement. It represents a final moment, containment, stillness. And that contradiction lingers because it suggests intent, or at least action that requires explanation. Not just what happened, but why this method, this location, this choice. And those are the questions that remain open. Part 6. What investigators can and can't say. As with many active or unresolved investigations, not everything is public. Authorities have confirmed the discovery and identity, but just over 2 years later, there is still no official cause of death released, despite there having been a forensic autopsy. There was also speculation that Victoria was targeted for providing information associated with gang-related activity to local law enforcement. A source speaking on the case was quoted saying, "It's all gang-related." The source claimed local gangs were actively waging wars amongst their rivals and leaving the public caught in the crossfire during the time this case was unfolding. The source also made mention that one of the gangs local to the area made news reports as being potential downstream beneficiaries of Alex Murdaugh, the face of one of the most high-profile cases South Carolina has seen, as he orchestrated a massive financial fraud empire and in 2023 was convicted of his wife Maggie and son Paul's murder. Although the source seemed to feel certain that the root cause of the violence that has surrounded the small town of Walterboro in the past, especially in this case, seems to be gang-related, many official details remain limited when it comes to Victoria Beach. And that silence is important to acknowledge. Because in real cases, absence of information is not always absence of progress. Sometimes it's the opposite. It can mean evidence is still being evaluated. It can mean leads are still being followed. It can mean the story is still unfolding in places the public cannot see. But to those outside the investigation, it feels like uncertainty, and uncertainty tends to grow in silence. At some point, every case like this stops being about location. It stops being about procedure or about timeline reconstruction, and it becomes something simpler, something heavier. What happened in the final moments before someone became a missing person story. Because behind every abandoned building discovery is a human trajectory that stopped early, a life that did not follow its expected path forward, and a series of decisions or events that are no longer fully visible. That's what makes these cases linger in memory long after headlines fade. Not just the mystery, but the interruption. Part 7, in her memory. There is something that deserves to be said plainly, because at the center of all of this is not a location, not a timeline, not an investigation. It's a person. Victoria Beach was 32 years old, and while most of what the public discussion around this case focuses on is how her story ended, there is a much larger truth that exists outside that frame. She was more than the moment she became part of an investigation, more than the day she was reported missing, more than the circumstances that brought attention to her name. She was someone who existed long before any of this was ever written down, someone who had routines, people she spoke to regularly, places she returned to. Small, ordinary moments that never make it into headlines, but make up the vast majority of a life. And that's the part that often gets lost in cases like this. Not because people don't care, but because stories tend to narrow themselves down to the moment everything changed. But a person is not defined by their final chapter. They're defined by everything that came before it. And in remembering that, the tone of the story shifts, even briefly. Because it stops being just about what happened inside an abandoned building and becomes about what was taken from the world and from someone who was simply living their life to the best of their ability before any of this began. There are families and people who still carry this story in a different way than the public ever will. Victoria had friends who spoke about her publicly following the headlines. She was a mother of 2 boys, and she had a mother that did not deserve to lose a child, especially not this way. For them, this is not a mystery episode. It's not content. It's not a distant case file. It's a real absence that continues to exist in their lives long after the rest of the world has moved on. And regardless of what is ultimately discovered or what remains unanswered, there is a hope that does not disappear just because time passes. The hope that clarity still exists somewhere ahead. The hope that answers, if they are still possible, will eventually surface. Because sometimes the most important thing we can hold on to in stories like this is not speculation, not theory or conclusion, but the possibility that the full truth has not yet fully been seen. And until it is, a name like Victoria's is not just part of a case. It is part of a search that is still ongoing, in one form or another. A search for understanding, a search for resolution, and for some, a search for peace. And so we say her name, not as an endpoint to a mystery, but as a reminder that there was a life here before any of this became a story we tell. And that life deserves to be remembered in full, not only in fragments. Part 8, where the story stands now. As of now, the case remains under investigation, and like many cases tied to abandoned spaces, it sits in an unfinished state. Known but not understood. Documented but not resolved. And so the abandoned building remains what it always was physically, but not emotionally. It is no longer just a structure in the small town of Walterboro, South Carolina. It is a point in a timeline that still doesn't fully connect. A pause in a story that has not yet reached its conclusion. Abandoned places often get described as empty, but they're not empty. They're just waiting. Waiting for attention, waiting for discovery, waiting for explanation, and sometimes waiting for answers that may take years to arrive. Thank you for joining me for another segment of Beyond the Abandoned. Before we close out today's episode, I just want to take a moment to say thank you. Since the episode covering the Robert Fuller case, a lot of new people have become part of the Echoes family, and it seems a lot of you took time to sit with that story, and I don't take that lightly. It's always a strange thing when something you create about difficult stories starts to travel further than you ever planned. But I'm genuinely grateful that so many of you are here now, and that you're listening, thinking, and engaging with these cases the way that you are. This space has always been about more than just the adventure of urban exploration for me. It's about remembering the places, the histories, and the people tied to them, even when the answers aren't complete or when the story is hard to tell. So if you're new here because of that last episode, I'm really glad you're here. And if you've been listening for a while, thank you for continuing to come back and explore these abandoned places with me. It means more than you probably realize. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe to Echoes of Elsewhere wherever you listen to podcasts if you haven't already. You can also find me on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok at Urbex Echoes and Echoes of Elsewhere on Facebook. Last but not least, if you have a story connected to an abandoned place or a mystery tied to one, I'd love to hear it, so please reach out to me on social media or via email at urbexechoes@gmail.com. I will be back in a few weeks. Until then, keep exploring the allure and the abandoned, the beauty of decay, and the echoes of elsewhere.